Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for joining our webinar today, Ask a Professional Scrum Trainer, featuring Professional Scrum Trainer Mark Noneman. My name is Eric Naberg, and I'll be your host today. I run marketing operations here at scrum.org, and this is your opportunity to ask an expert. Mark he'll tell you a bit about his experience and what he's been doing, but he's here to take your questions and hopefully help guide you, to give you a little coaching to help you improve. Next slide, Lindsay. So a little bit about the series. This is your opportunity to ask Scrum experts. We try to run these once a month, and if we don't address your questions, we'll respond the best we can via email post-webinar to help answer those. Generally, we get way more questions than we are able to answer. Next question, next slide. So just briefly, who is Scrum.org? For those of you new to this series and new to Scrum.org, Scrum.org offers training, certification, and information around Scrum to help you improve how you work. We're founded by and run by Ken Schwaber, the co-creator of Scrum. He continues to be our chairman in helping to run our organization, our business. We provide lots of different training classes taught by our professional Scrum trainers, who go through a very deep and detailed training, validation, and verification before they're able to teach the classes. One of the things that makes our training quite unique is the fact that it's consistent around the world. So we have about 250 or so trainers all over the globe teaching the same content, same material, bringing their own experiences, as you'll hear from Mark today, into the classroom. But you're getting a consistent learning experience globally. So if you have teams that are distributed, this is quite helpful. If you have a big organization, multiple trainers working together to teach your teams. We provide certification to help validate knowledge of what you've learned, whether it's in the class or outside of the classroom, and then constantly providing new free resources up on our website to help you learn and continue learning pre and post class. Next slide. So with that, I will turn it over to Mark to introduce himself. Mark.
Thanks, Eric. As Eric said, I'm Mark Noneman. I'm with a company called Agility Software. And just a little bit about my background. My degrees are actually in electrical engineering. I started as an electrical designer way back when, and also did system engineering and project management and things like that. And in the 1990s, I was working for a manufacturing company, and we did a lot of work with what we would now call lean practices in the manufacturing side. And we recognized we were getting a lot of benefit out of that at that time. So I was working with a group of people to try to figure out how do we apply those ideas in the design of new products. And you can't use the same practices, because in manufacturing, doing the same thing over and over again, and of course, you're building a new product, you're doing it for the first time by definition. So you have to go back to first principles and figure out how to apply those. And in the early 2000s, I was working for a software company, and they made and sold software, business-to-business software. And I had a development team in Dublin, Ireland, and spent a lot of time there. And the lead developer contacted me one day and said, "Hey, we just read about this thing called Scrum, and we would like to work that way." And he sent me a little article and email. So I read the article. I said, "Of course, yeah, that makes sense." Nothing new there, of course. It seemed pretty easy. And so we set off to begin using Scrum. But of course, we struggled quite a bit, because we were really trying to use some book learning knowledge and figuring out on our own. So we decided to go get some help. And I think about 2003 or so, we decided to go to a Scrum training class by this fellow named Ken Schwaber that we just heard about. It's one of the earlier Scrum classes, and the lead developer and I went there. And we spent 2 days in a huge ballroom with hundreds of people learning about Scrum from Ken and many other people helping him. And so we learned a lot of what we were doing wrong, and we went back to work, and we started to make some better progress. And in that company, part of my role was also to bring in different practices and tools from the industry. When different business units were challenged with different issues, I had no authority, but if they asked for help, we could find solutions that they might want to adopt. And so many of those groups in that company started to adopt Scrum as well. So in addition to learning how to do Scrum, I also and my team learned how to help other people adopt Scrum. And I left that company in 2007 to branch out on my own as an independent consultant, and I've been helping people adopt Scrum and other Agile practices ever since. And I currently live in San Antonio, Texas, or at least I have a house there that I visit sometimes. And I work with companies all around North America and occasionally in Europe and other places as well, helping them learn about Scrum and Agile and how to get better business value. So that's me.
Thanks, Mark. And we can just jump to the next slide, Lindsay. So just some quick guidelines. You've got the GoToWebinar tool hopefully open, because that's how you're watching this webinar. For those of you who are watching it live, you'll see a questions box there. Start asking your questions, and Mark is happy to take them. We'll respond to them as we can and as quickly as we can, and just keep them going. So we've got a couple that have come in already. And I think the first one we can start, and this is kind of I think in a lot of what you're focusing on now around measurement and in management. It says here, I think this is a controversial subject, but maybe not, but although it does come up quite a bit and gets argued quite a bit. Should estimates when running planning and forecasting be done based on effort, time, volume, complexity? Can you give, and I'll summarize, but can you give some thoughts on how you do estimating and what sort of things may make sense, may not make sense? What sort of things get in the way, Mark?
Oh yeah, that is a challenging question for a lot of people. It's pretty common in the Scrum world or Agile world more generally to use relative estimates, so that it's not in units of time or function points or lines of code or hours or days or anything like that. Typically, people would use a system called points, and that can be very confusing for people. Sometimes I've tried to emphasize that there are no units, and so we estimate in gummy bears or paper clips or something like that, just to emphasize that these are not things that indicate the traditional estimate of time that a lot of project management type estimates are used to. But I was a traditional project manager for a long time, and there's always two steps to estimate. The first is some method of estimating complexity, and then a conversion factor. For example, we used to use lines of code. It's not a very good estimate, but how anything else, okay. And then if we'd estimate the lines of code, then we had also a performance conversion of how many lines of code per hour, or hours per lines of code typically. And then we could do a little basic math in order to try to turn the estimate of lines of code into time. So really we're kind of doing the same thing in Agile, except we're not trying to estimate the lines of code. We were never good at it before, and so we're just being honest about it. And so usually I would coach people to start with these arbitrary units, sometimes called points or story points, depends on the environment that you might be in, but it's all the same basic idea of relative points. Now, for more advanced teams that have been doing Agile for quite a while, it's one of the things that they learn to get really good at is to divide up bigger chunks of work, items on your product backlog in Scrum, into very thin vertical slices, is usually how we call it, thin vertical slices. And if you get really good at that, and you can divide the work up into really small pieces, each of which probably takes something on the order of a day, maybe it's half a day, maybe it's a day and a half. At that point, who cares? Doesn't matter how many points it is. We're just dividing it down into really thin slices. And so once you get really good at that, you don't have to worry about, at least the development team doesn't really have to worry about, hey, is this a 2-point item or a 20-point item or of course, most people use Fibonacci series, as you're probably aware. So 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, et cetera. They get much bigger. The numbers get much, much bigger as the size of the estimate gets bigger. And that's because fundamentally humans aren't very good at estimating big things, and we're better at estimating smaller things. So we get a little fine grain when they're really small, and when they're really big, we get really coarse. And again, advanced teams can kind of throw that away from the perspective of, is this item appropriate for us to work on in any given sprint? Now, having said all that, the purpose for estimating, there's really only one reason to estimate the amount of effort or the complexity or using points or whatever means you might use, and that is to forecast. And that forecast is a bit of a magic word in the Scrum world or in the Agile world. And there's two kinds of forecasts that have to go on. The development team has to forecast how much work they can do within the sprint. And if they're estimating items by points, they might know historically they've been able to do, let's say, between 18 and 23 points from sprint to sprint. It varies. And so if the conditions this sprint are relatively similar to the conditions in the past, they would probably expect to do something roughly around 18 to 23 points. But if there were some people missing this sprint, they'd probably do fewer points. Or maybe they saw an uptick in the last sprint and they're able to maybe believe they can do more work in the sprint because perhaps they've added automation or they've got team members with new skills or something like that. And so they might plan a little bit more work. So one level of this forecast idea is at the team level, and that's one reason you could estimate. The other important part of estimating is at the product level, the longer term view that the product owner would be very concerned about, and stakeholders too. And so by looking at the total amount of estimated work on the product backlog and using the team's ability to complete work, and you might know we call that velocity. So if we look at the amount of work the team is able to complete in previous sprints, that is to say, turning product backlog items into done, potentially releasable software in the software world, or just an increment in other domains. And we look at our historical ability, that's like how fast have we been able to drive? Well, if we look at the amount of work we have yet to do and we use our historical ability, we can estimate approximately when we might see certain content in that potentially releasable done increment, or when we might hit a particular milestone like a release, or when we might achieve specific business objectives. So however you decide to estimate, whether it's simply knowing that it's small enough that we can get it done in a short period of time, or by using story points or any other means, remember the only reason for estimating is so that you can forecast how much work we can do in a sprint, and also over the longer term, over multiple sprints, forecast when we can achieve certain objectives. A release is a very common objective, especially early on in people adopting Scrum. So I guess that would be my advice. Don't worry too much about the method. Just remember, it's only good for forecasting. That's its purpose.
Great, thanks, Mark. And kind of tying to that question, actually, there's a couple in here that tie to it, and I want to use this one first. When creating your sprint backlog during sprint planning, my team wants to fill the backlog with work, even though they know they can't do all of the work. How do I show the team that it isn't the best approach? Instead, recommending that we look at previous sprints and number of stories accepted and so on to really guide that work and just take enough work to get started.
Right. Good. Well, yeah, it is directly related because, of course, during the sprint planning, what the development team, or at least one of the most important things the development team is doing, one of three things actually, is to forecast how much work they can do in the sprint. Now, of course, it's also true that at the end of the sprint, we care about whatever work is actually done, whatever your definition of done is, but it should be potentially releasable. And if you have other work you plan to do and it's not done, then it goes back on the product backlog. So I guess in some sense you could say it doesn't matter too much, except that in creating a sprint, a plan, a forecast for the sprint, we're setting expectations with other people. We're setting an expectation with the product owner. We're setting expectations with the stakeholders. And if we don't meet those expectations, then it's very difficult for other people to have any realistic means of trying to predict or forecast the longer term. We're back to that forecast word again. So on the one hand, we'd like to have a forecast that's reasonable, that represents the amount of work that the team can actually do. And of course, we're trying to predict the future, so we don't know exactly. It's not a guarantee. It's not necessarily precise, but using our historical ability is kind of a good measuring stick to give us an estimate. So that's the reason why we'd like to have an estimate that represents what's likely to happen, plus or minus, within a level of uncertainty that the team has some confidence level in ability to complete. So if you're planning more work than you know you can complete, then the problem is we haven't been able to manage expectations very well. And then management starts to ask questions about why are you never completing all your work, and then we get help that we really don't want. So that would be my rationalization for why we'd like to try to have an estimate of the work we think we can actually complete. Again, within some level of uncertainty, with some level of confidence. It's not a guarantee. It's not going to be perfect. But if it's way off every time, then we're not managing expectations very well. So that would be the rationale for why we'd want to do that. And then again, it's up to the team, though, to really decide how much work they can do, then to create a sprint backlog in terms of representing how they plan to accomplish the work that they believe they can do. And of course, the third element of sprint planning would be the goal for the sprint, making sure we have a clear agreement with the product owner and the development team about the sprint goal. So again, all of that, the forecast and the sprint backlog should represent how we're going to achieve the sprint goal. So what we could do is focus on the consequences of having a plan that's too much work. And what that likely means is that if we have a good sprint goal that is reflecting what's in what we've planned to do through the forecast and the sprint backlog, then it doesn't seem very likely that by the end of the sprint we'll have made much progress toward our sprint goal. So again, we're not doing a very good job of helping management, customers perhaps, and even the product owner to understand what they should be able to expect moving forward into the future from sprint to sprint. So it needs to be a partnership between the development team and the product owner. The product owner certainly knowing what needs to be done and what's most important to do now. And of course, that's reflected in the product backlog and the communication the product owner has with the development team. And on the other side of that equation, the development team has an obligation to try to help the product owner understand how much work can be done in any one sprint, given the current conditions, which includes the specific work that's at the top of the product backlog. It includes, the condition of the development team, this sprint, who's here or not here. Maybe we have new people that we have to train. Maybe some people are on holiday or vacation. Maybe we're adopting some new tools and we're learning about that. But whatever the current condition is, the development team has a responsibility to help the product owner understand what is likely to be accomplished in the sprint. And those three pieces during sprint planning all fit together. We got to have the product backlog items that we forecast we can do. We have the sprint backlog that represents how we plan to accomplish those items so that we can achieve the third item, the sprint goal. So we want all those three things to be aligned. And those are all the reasons why we'd like to have a good estimate, or as we say, forecast of which items we think we can accomplish, of course, how we're going to do that through the sprint backlog in order to achieve the sprint goal. So if those things are out of alignment, then we're having a lot of difficulty helping everybody understand what's going on. So it's a key element of Scrum to help us get a grasp of where we're likely to be going in the future.
So Mark, this question actually came in before this conversation started, or this particular conversation started, but I think it's tied nicely. So I want to bring in April's question here, which is how important are sprint goals? You've just talked a lot about sprint goals, but how important are they? Her team cannot seem to create one, and they've never had one since they started using Scrum. So you talk to me, this is talking a little bit about the importance, which you've done a bit already, but also maybe some guidance on how to create good sprint goals.
Awesome, that's a great question. I have to also say that at least amongst people that are newly adopting Scrum, I would say the sprint goal is probably the least well-used element of the Scrum framework. People don't understand it very well, and it requires some work, some collaboration amongst the Scrum team in order to be able to craft a good one. And so early on, we're often missing some of the elements. So one of the things, of course, let me connect some dots here. I kind of did it, but let me be more explicit about it. As we said during sprint planning, there are three things. We're going to have our our forecast of product backlog items. We're going to have our sprint backlog representing how we think we can accomplish that work, and a sprint goal that we're trying to achieve this sprint. Now, when the development team pulls items off of the product backlog during sprint planning, or any time that they're planning new work, they can only pull off of the top of the ordered product backlog. We call it ordered in the Scrum guide, but of course, if you want to think of it as prioritized, whatever, priority is one element, but so is value, and so are other things. And that helps us determine the order. Well, if we're going to pull items off of the top of the ordered product backlog, and we're going to have a goal for what we think we can achieve in the sprint, then of course, obviously, the items at the top of the product backlog must be related in some way. So this is often the missing element. Product owners are new to Scrum too, usually, in new adoptions, although sometimes they have experience but haven't thought about this need to order the product backlog so that there's a collection of items at the top of the product backlog that allows the team, in collaboration with the product owner, to craft a goal for this particular sprint, whether it's 2, 3, 4 weeks, whatever it might be. 2 weeks, of course, is very common. I'll just kind of use that as an example. Sprint length. What are we trying to achieve this sprint? Well, of course, 2 weeks matters because that kind of is an indicator of how much work we might be able to do. Of course, using our historical ability in previous sprints to create our forecast. So this requires then that the product owner order the product backlog so that items are grouped together. Now, in the Scrum world, or the Agile world generally, we call this cohesion. So we'd like items at the top of the backlog to be cohesive, so that when they plan them into the sprint, first of all, if we've been looking at the product backlog, we already know what the goal is going to be this sprint. Maybe our goal this sprint is to improve security, right? If we've been talking about the product backlog and we're looking at the ordered list, we already know the items at the top of the product backlog are about improving security. We've been talking about that. So if we're doing that, and we're doing it, and we're learning how to do that well, as we improve there, we can come into sprint planning already knowing that, at least broadly speaking, we're trying to improve security. Now we plan the specific items at the top of the product backlog into the sprint, however many it is the development team thinks it can do given the current conditions. And of course, working on the sprint backlog, knowing that we have an objective to improve security. Now, once we've figured out the exact items that are in our forecast, it's not a guarantee again, but that's a team's best estimate of what they think they can accomplish. Now we could craft some more specific statement about improving security. Maybe we're going to improve security around user data protection by 50%. Now I just made that up. I don't even know if that would make sense in your context, but because we knew what our broad objective was, we know what specific items we forecasted, we can then craft a statement. So again, it's this collaborative effort. We have to find some kind of cohesion. And by the way, there are different kinds of cohesion. There could be development cohesion. If we worked on these items together, it would help the whole team work together toward a shared goal. And of course, that improves team productivity. There could be business cohesion. These items go together to help us to achieve a business objective, a new customer segment or a new product or something like that. Or it could be a customer or user cohesion. That is to say, these items go together in terms of the customer or user's workflow of using the software or the product that we're creating. And very often we find those different dimensions of cohesion are typically not independent. It's pretty common that if we're working on a given area of customer workflow, those also will lead to development cohesion and help the team work together more effectively in a given area of the product. So think about all the pieces that go together. And one thing we haven't really talked about yet, although I've alluded to it, is this idea of refinement of the product backlog. And of course, if we're good at refinement and we're talking about product backlog items before we ever get to plan them in the sprint, we're also asking questions, discussing how to group them together to create this idea of cohesion. So that, yeah, in the next sprint, we're going to work on security, but once we've got enough security, we know that the next thing that we need to work on is making the product run on Hadoop in addition to Oracle or something. I don't know, another made up thing. And maybe once we get that working, we know that after that, it's going to be really important to improve the customer's ability, I don't know, to increase their methods of payment, so we can add other payment methods into the user's customer's workflow. So we can even get a bit of a view into multiple sprints potentially by talking about the product backlog in advance before we get there, and grouping items to create cohesive units or cohesive chunks of work that the team can plan from sprint to sprint to sprint. So I think about those things and see if you can form a sprint backlog. One other quick item before we get to the next question. Occasionally I run into Scrum teams that are supporting multiple products or multiple different activities in a single team. And if you're doing that within a single sprint, it can be very difficult to have a cohesive chunk of work that the team could identify a common goal around. And I would try to encourage finding a way to have a cohesive chunk of work. Even in that case, maybe you support one particular constituency this sprint, and you'll support a different stakeholder group the next sprint. And that might point, that's one example, that might point to a way to focus the team on a common goal. Without a shared goal, the productivity of the team will be less. And that's something else to be thoughtful about, why you would want a sprint goal.
Great, thanks. And there's a bunch of other questions around sprint goal, but I want to move to another topic, and then we can always come back as well. So how important is it to have technical knowledge and coding experience as a Scrum Master?
Well, of course, that would only matter if you're working with a software team, obviously. And of course, Scrum.org, our mission is to improve the delivery of the professional delivery of software. But of course, Scrum can be used in many other domains. I teach Scrum, for example, to marketing groups, so they're not really doing any coding. But so generifying the question a little bit, does the Scrum Master have to have development team level of experience or knowledge? And I would say some awareness is helpful, but it isn't necessary for a Scrum Master to have been a developer, for example, a coder in software, or a tester, or any other specific role. But if they don't understand the overall flow of work within the development team, it might be difficult for them to identify challenges that the team has that the team may not even be aware of. Especially teams newer to Scrum, they typically try to use the practices and the tools they used when they were doing their previous method, often waterfall methods. And in an environment like waterfall, where you're handing it off from skill to skill, from a person to another person, and we find that often Scrum teams struggle with that because we have a very short period of time, just a few weeks, to get something that actually works, that potentially releasable increment. And so we're going to have to change the way we work. Otherwise, fundamentally, we're not going to get different results if all the development team members still use the same practices they used before with the same tools they used before. You could start using Scrum that way, that's fine, but you'll find that you don't get a lot of different results yet. The development team's actually going to have to learn how to work more together more closely, to adopt practices that are known to work in a more agile environment. Things like test-first development or test-driven development in the software world, for example, continuous integration, pair work. Those kinds of practices are common in the Agile community because we know that that helps us get to that potentially releasable done increment in a very short period of time. So if that's necessary and important, but the Scrum Master isn't familiar with any of those practices or tools, even though they may not be able to do them themselves, but they have no awareness of them, it'd be very difficult for the Scrum Master to identify barriers that the team is having that the team doesn't see as a barrier, and reflect that back to the team and say, here's my observation. We're still handing off. We start off the sprint where somebody, a business analyst, for example, does requirements, and then we hand that off to a coder. And then once the coding is done, we hand that off to a tester. And we're having a lot of difficulty getting all the testing done in the sprint. That seems like a challenge. It seems like we're trying to do waterfall in a sprint. So maybe we should look at practices that other, more advanced Agile Scrum practices, and I've heard about this thing called test-driven development. Maybe we should look into that. What do you guys think about that? And if you don't have awareness of those things, it would be very difficult for the Scrum Master to make recommendations, suggestions, or even coaching of individuals or the whole team to continuously improve and get better and better, even just to achieve what the Scrum framework ultimately demands, which is that potentially releasable done increment every single sprint. And if we're not able to achieve that, I mean, that's okay. We are where we are, but we need to be striving for that. So if the Scrum Master is going to help us strive for that, I think they have to have at least some awareness of the domain and awareness of good practices in the domain, and be able to find ways to identify where the team might be struggling and how the team, or where the team might want to look in the industry to improve and get better and better at delivering value using Scrum.
Great. So keeping on this theme of helping people improve, there's a question around retrospectives, which is where one of the many places we learn to improve.
Right.
Do you have any suggestions on how to better get people to participate in retros?
Yeah, that's often, I often hear from teams that have been using Scrum for a little while, maybe 6 months or a year or so, is that just our retrospectives are really boring. Nothing ever changes. Do we really have to do this every sprint? Couldn't we just do it, once, maybe every other sprint, or once a quarter? And of course, the answer is no. The problem is we're doing the retrospectives in an ineffective way. So let's improve our retrospectives. So we need to improve everything that we're doing in Scrum, including the different events of Scrum, like retrospectives or planning or the review, whatever it might be. So in terms of the retrospective, first of all, there's an excellent book out there that's been out in the Scrum community for quite a long time, and I'm trying to remember off the top of my head, but I believe it's called Agile Retrospectives, and it's written by Diana Larson and Esther Derby. And that book is kind of a cookbook of different retrospective techniques. But more recently, I would also recommend that you look into something called liberating structures. And these have been around for a while. They're not specific to Scrum or the Agile community, but the Agile community is really beginning to embrace them, because it's a set of facilitation techniques to really get everyone engaged. So back to the root problem here, hey, how do we get people to really participate in the retrospective? Well, maybe they're not participating because they feel disengaged, because they feel that it doesn't apply to them. In the software world in particular, I'm generalizing, but development team members often are a little bit introverted. And so getting people to engage in communication, particularly to start a conversation, can be quite a challenge for them. So using something like liberating structures, even combined with some of the different structures that are in or different techniques that are in the Agile Retrospectives book by Derby and Larson, might be a way to get there. The main thing is that we've got to get everybody engaged. So too many times I come into a retrospective as a coach or a consultant, and I see the Scrum Master asking everybody to do silent writing for 5 minutes about everything that was awesome, and then everybody puts sticky notes on the wall about everything that was terrible, and then they whine and complain for a few minutes, and everybody leaves after 20, 25 minutes. That's not engaging people very effectively, and so we need to find ways for the development team. Remember, it includes development team members and the product owner in the retrospective. In fact, the Scrum Master needs to participate too, because if the Scrum Master's having challenges with any of the other team members or interacting with stakeholders, it's about all of us improving. So the Scrum Master is part of that as well. How can all of us participate? And so that's one thing I would do. I would look to liberating structures for specific facilitation techniques. All of those are designed specifically to get everybody engaged in problem identification, some of those structures, some of them to brainstorm potential solutions, and then how do we take initial steps to some of those solutions, which really helps us implement an incremental evolutionary change process for the entire Scrum team. So those would be a few tips. Specific liberating structures you might look into, of course, 1, 2, 4, all. I'm using some liberating structure names now. So if you go to liberatingstructures.org, you can find a lot of information about even how-to guides about how to do every one of these. 1, 2, 4 all is a very common liberating structure. I use it all the time, and it's a way to get people engaged by thinking about it, talking to one other person about it, and then getting together into groups of 4 or small groups to have conversation, and then sharing with everybody what you've talked about. Another really important technique in the retrospective specifically, I think, is Troika consulting. And this can help teams talk about particular problems and come up with ideas about how to solve them, and there's some structures around that. So just a couple of examples, and there are many others that you'll probably find useful in making your retrospectives much more effective. Now, the latest update of the Scrum Guide in talking about retrospectives, which is the end of 2017 was the last update, actually requires that every retrospective produce at least one committed, actionable plan to improve. And so whether that's the most effective way to get people to improve or not, I'm not sure. But nevertheless, I don't think we should use the Scrum Guide as a weapon to say, well, we have to because the Scrum Guide says. I think what we're trying to do is encourage people to recognize that we have to have something actionable come out of that retrospective so that we can actually make change. It's not going to get better on its own. And again, those approaches, Liberating Structures and the Agile Retrospective book, I think are good resources for you to use to find ways to improve your sprint retrospective.
Great. So, Mark, our teams maintain a product of an older technology stack, and we're now looking to introduce a completely new set of technologies. Of course, with new technologies comes a lot of need for training, knowledge sharing on all the new stuff, while still trying to accomplish our old objectives. How do you manage this across sprints?
Well, this is an interesting challenge because the key issue, of course, is time. And that is to say that if you're going to learn a new skill or a new technology or a new tool, if you're going to bring new people up to speed on the technology you're already using or the product you already have, it's going to require learning. And learning requires time. And there is no short circuit for that. Now, at the same time, even while we're doing that learning, we still have to deliver value every single sprint. So that means we got to find the balancing act in order to spend some time learning, even while we start to deliver value, or continue to deliver value, I should say. Now, there's a couple of ways that people do that. There's specific structures you can set up. For example, some of my clients have a book club where the team's reading a book, and maybe an hour a week or 10, 15 minutes a day, they talk about a chapter or some small section of the book. And maybe they do practice a little bit of using the technique they're learning about, whether it's pair programming or test-driven development or continuous integration or something, and begin using the skills right away. Now, of course, you're using skills that you're less familiar with, and that means, it takes a little bit longer than it will later when you're good at it. So that's another element of time we have to think about, is that not only do we have to set aside some time to do the learning, we have to learn the skill or the practice. And as we're learning, we're going to take more time than when we eventually get good at it. So there's a little bit of a slowdown as we adopt those practices, tools, and skills. So because it's going to take time, we need to plan for it. And that'll occur a couple of ways. It's going to affect our forecast. So we're kind of back to our very first question. During sprint planning, if the team knows that they're going to bring new people up to speed this sprint, and they weren't doing that last sprint, well, that's going to consume some time of team members that were producing value last sprint. And look, this is just the reality. And I know some people want to deny reality or believe that somehow you'll learn new things by magic, but there's no magic, and there never was. We need to set aside a little bit of time to teach these new people, or to learn the new skill, or to adopt a new tool. And we should put that into our plan. Now, we can put it into our plan multiple ways. We could put it as product backlog items, and we could estimate them because it will consume some of our capacity. That's a perfectly legitimate way to do it. Some people don't like to do that because the product owner has a lot of trouble ordering items like train new people compared to this new feature that would let us sell 1,000 new products next month. that would be challenging for the product owner. So another way we could do it is simply to allocate some capacity and say, look, this sprint, of course, we have to do this in agreement with the product owner because we're spending money, and the product owner is responsible for the value delivered for the money we're spending. But look, let's set aside whatever it might be, 10%, 15%, 20%, whatever it might be. We're going to set aside a little bit of our capacity in order to train people, learn a new thing, adopt a new tool to get better. And we'll plan that into our sprint backlog, even though it may not have a product backlog item, because we have already agreed we're going to set aside 10% of our capacity in order to do that. That's perfectly legitimate approach as long as we're all in agreement that that's what we're doing. Now, next sprint, we might change that capacity that we're allocating, maybe more. Maybe we'll do 20% next sprint, or maybe we'll do less. Maybe next sprint we'll only do 5%, or even 0, because there's some critical business objective we're trying to achieve, and we'll pick up improvement activities again in the next sprint. We never want to drop it. I'd say 0 is probably never a good idea, but we certainly should vary it from sprint to sprint based on the particular objectives that we need to achieve for the organization. So time is the answer, and we have to plan for that time. So we can set it aside. We can have items on the backlog that represent that time that we'll plan in and figure out as a team how long we think it'll take us out of our capacity. We could just simply reserve capacity. And then if we're going to be using practices, skills, or tools that will, we're not very good at right now, when we estimate the time it'll take to accomplish the task we need to achieve in order to get those product backlogs items into a potentially releasable done increment, we may recognize that it'll take us a little bit longer. We're not setting time aside per se, but we know that this task done the previous way, maybe it would have taken us a few hours, and this time we're going to say, well, it's going to take us a little bit longer because we've decided working in this new way is going to be better once we're good at it. And so that might mean that our forecast will be a little bit less than it would have been, so that we can accommodate not just set aside time for learning or practice, but the actual execution in a new way. So as long as we're all doing this in agreement between the product owner and the development team, it can be a happy time because we're learning and improving. And of course, the product owner will have communication with the stakeholders explaining what we're doing, so that looking at the long-term view and looking at achieving business objectives, there's a short-term, let's say a hit, if you will, in what we're going to be able to accomplish, because we believe in the long run we'll be able to accomplish much more, and we'll get a great return on that investment. And that's a conversation the product owner is going to want to have, probably with backup with the development team, or from the development team, having that conversation with stakeholders so that everybody understands why we're doing these improvement activities, why are they important for us, why are they good for us.
Great, thanks, Mark. So Scrum, this one goes to the heart of kind of your new passion, or certainly it's probably not a new passion, but one of your new roles is a steward for evidence-based management and agile metrics solutions here at Scrum.org. Scrum states that there are more ways to measure value than just revenue. In the real world, business environments, they use different KPIs broken down into revenue, reduced costs, and other things. Can you shed some light on some of the best ways to measure value beyond just revenue?
Yeah, good. Of course, revenue is important because, at least in a for-profit company, without revenue, we won't have any money to pay your paychecks. So, I mean, it's a good thing. But revenue comes last, if you will. I suppose you could argue profit comes last, but which is, of course, true. There's a lot of activity that leads up to being able to make that revenue. And so we need to understand other measures, as you said. Now, I use a little model. In fact, there's a little Scrum Tapas video on Scrum.org. If you, I think if you search on the Scrum.org website, you'll be able to find a little video of mine around agile metrics that explains a little model and just a way of thinking about different kinds of metrics. So revenue is what we call an impact metric. That is to say, it affects the organization or the company. And the word effect is important because it could be positive or negative, right? If revenue goes down, usually that's not viewed as a good thing. And when revenue increases, usually that's a good thing, depending on what we've sold, I suppose. But it impacts the company. Now, before we can get to that impact, I'm going to kind of work backwards through the model. Verbally, we have to affect users and customers, and we call those outcomes. And an outcome could be that a user can accomplish a new thing. That is to say, they can do something they couldn't do before. Maybe there's an outcome that they're able to purchase new products. Maybe their workflow is smoother or easier, or maybe the quality of the product through their experience is better, that they have fewer problems or fewer defects or something like that. And because that affects users and customers, we refer to those as outcomes. Now, the benefit of improving outcomes would be that, of course, customers perhaps are happier, or they can buy more, or they can refer more new customers to us, or at least they would be willing to. And we can measure all of those things. So, for example, the latter thing, the customer's willingness to refer others, you might know is known as the Net Promoter Score. And you measure that by a survey. So that's not a hard metric like revenue, it's qualitative in the sense we're asking people's opinion. But remember, we're asking real users and customers, would you be willing, or how likely are you to refer our product and service to others, to your friends, your families, your colleagues? And then by taking those ratings across a reasonable number of people and taking that survey repeatedly, periodically over time, we can look at their willingness and how it changes over time. Are we getting more willingness to refer others or less? Now, how will that change? How will their willingness to refer others change? Well, of course, it'll change based on what we output, which is, of course, the thing that occurs prior to outcomes. So we output new features, we output releases, we output instructional videos, we output promotional offerings. Those are all the different kinds of outputs that could come from Scrum teams, and many, many more that you'll be able to think of. So anything that, if you could think of it this way, anything that leaves the company and then is presented to or made available to users and customers is an output. The result of that output, that is to say what customers think about it, is an outcome. And then what customers and users do about their opinion about what we output, that is to say the effect of the outcome, will impact the company. So those are three things that we can look at. Now, most organizations, especially coming from more traditional waterfall development, or having not thought a lot about agile metrics in this way, tend to have a lot of metrics on outputs, or even the things that lead to outputs, which we generally call activity. If you're in a Scrum team, it would be development. So what are you doing in the sprint? That's your activity. That in and of itself is not valuable, and we won't know whether it's valuable or not until we output it. That is, it creates an output. And then, of course, users and customers have to actually have it, use it, and form an opinion about it. It has to affect them. That will create an outcome. So those are the four categories of metrics we think about: activity metrics, output metrics, outcome metrics, and impact metrics. And of course, one leads to the next. We have to have activities that get to outputs. Those outputs affect users and customers. What they do about it will impact the organization, which gives us profit in order to pay your paycheck so that we can have activities and development to create more outputs. All right, so that's the model. Revenue and profit are going to be impact metrics. A lot of people start off with internal metrics like velocity, for example, which measures activity of the development team, but that's it. It doesn't tell us whether the customers like what they're doing or whether what they're doing is the most valuable stuff. It's not a useless metric. It can help us in forecasting, as we talked about earlier in this session, because if we know what we've been able to do in the past, we can use that as a guide to what we're likely to be able to do in the future. Of course, that's true, and that can measure activity. Now, if the team is actually releasing their product and deploying it to users and customers during the sprint. And a lot of Scrum teams are able to do that. It takes a lot of improvement that we've also talked about in order to get there through continuous integration and continuous deployment, and automation, and things like that. Then actually the team's velocity is actually a measure of output because it's actually in the customer's hand. It's left the barn, if you will, and we're already affecting customers. We may or may not know what the effect is yet within the sprint because the sprint is such a short period of time. But I have some clients that are actually measuring outcomes from development work in the sprint. Sometimes that's possible. So we probably care about that activity. Again, velocity is useful for forecasting, but we also care about how long is it taking us to get valuable things into the customer's hand. And a measure like cycle time, which is the time from when the development team starts the work on something that would be recognized as valuable to a user or customer or to the business, to when it's actually released to that user or customer. Has to be released and deployed to the users and customers. That time is called cycle time. Now, it's usually more than one sprint, or it's often more than one sprint, because it often takes many little thin vertical slices to get to something that users and customers would recognize as valuable. Some new feature, depends on your domain. There are some domains where you can maybe have many valuable items in a single sprint, and that's, of course, that would be awesome. But how long is it taking you to get it into the users and customers' hands? Something like cycle time. Another measure that might be useful that sounds like velocity, but it's actually dramatically different, and that would be how much value are you delivering? It's really estimated value are you delivering to users and customers. Now for this, we need a different kind of an estimate. Earlier in this session, we talked about estimating the amount of effort or complexity, or again, using something like points, or as I said, gummy bears or something like that around product backlog items. But that's so that the development team can forecast how much work they can do in a sprint, and a product owner can forecast when something might be completed or delivered. But that doesn't tell us how valuable it is. So the product owner would want to lead an effort on the product backlog, probably with people who understand the value, like customers and users, or at least stakeholders, to estimate how much valuable different product backlog items are likely to deliver. It's an estimate, and we won't know exactly how much value it is until we actually can measure the outcomes and the impacts, but at least we could estimate what it is. Now, since we've estimated that, we could look at how much of that estimated value we've delivered from sprint to sprint. And so we could take a look at the Scrum team's ability to deliver value, not just items, but the relative value from item to item into the users and customers' hands. So that's another type of a measure, and again, it's a trend thing. We want to track that over time. Is the team able to deliver more amounts of value than they were able to deliver before? Are we delivering the most valuable things? Forget how big the items are. That's not really the key issue. How valuable are they? That's what matters. So that could be another metric. Of course, quality metrics can be very important too, because it affects the customer and user's experience, which would be an outcome. So looking at our actual delivered quality, whether that's through ease of use type measures or simply defect measures that are found in production, or measures like that. Then those you probably already have, and you should continue because it'll have an important effect on outcomes. So a few examples like that that you might want to consider in looking at metrics through the whole cycle of activity to outputs that can create outcomes for users and customers that will impact the organization so that we can invest in more activity.
Excellent. Thanks, Mark. And I want to be conscious of time. There's a large number of questions still here that we will get back to you on via email. I think we probably have time for one more if we can keep it somewhat short. Do you have experience working with distributed teams, and any suggestions on how to best work with distributed teams?
Yeah, I do. In fact, my very first team I mentioned, I think, was in Dublin, Ireland, and I was actually the product owner with that team. And we had people later on. We had people in India too. So my very first Scrum experience was a distributed team. Of course, we know that people that are co-located are going to able to achieve better performance because of what some people call osmotic communication. That is to say, we overhear things when we're physically co-located. But if you're not in an environment like that, how could you get as close as you can? And I would recommend that's how you think about it. So number one, use all the technology you possibly can. And I don't necessarily mean the electronic tools for Scrum. You can use them, that's fine. I really mean in order to communicate, because we also know, and it's in the Agile Manifesto as well, and Scrum learned this before then, that individuals interacting with each other are how we're going to get the most value. So how do we increase the interaction amongst people on the team? And of course with others too. So video conferencing, and I'm talking about always on. So a lot of my clients, when they first started showing, oh, well, we'll have video during sprint planning. That's not what I mean. Yeah, that's probably a good idea, but it isn't enough. We need to have the as much interactive communication as we can possibly have during the sprint when we're actually doing the work. So I'm not talking about just the events of Scrum, I'm talking about actually doing the work. So can we have an open communication line? Maybe some kind of visual imagery, because humans, many people are visual in nature, and I can see people, I have a more trustful conversation. Also visualize the different artifacts and different things that are helping you understand the state of the work. How are we going to visualize the product backlog so everybody on the team can see it? Of course, stakeholders need to be able to see that too. And that includes our forecast and our sprint backlog for this very sprint. How is everybody on the team getting a constant view of our state of progress toward the sprint goal? How are we going to visualize that so everybody can see it? And that could be electronic. There's nothing wrong with that, but maybe we'll need to have a team agreement that, hey, when we're working in this effort on this sprint in this team, we're going to have our video camera on at least during some core hours, let's say. We're always going to have up some representation of our progress toward the sprint goal, whether that's a burn down chart or some other means, whatever it is for us, we're always going to have that, looking at that and be able to communicate with others about the current state. Now, in addition to not being co-located, a lot of people are in multiple time zones. So now we've taken a hard problem and we've made it really hard. So my first advice is don't, but I know that's not really helpful. I would try to encourage viewing this as an impediment to getting the most out of Scrum for the organization. But what do we do in the meantime? Well, again, it's about interaction with people. So we've got to find ways of getting some overlap during the workday so that we can actually work together. Now, if you're, 12, I was on a team on the West Coast of the United States working with team members in India. That's 12 and a half or 13 and a half hours time difference, depending on the time of year. Well, to get overlap of hours means either somebody's up really early, like morning, like dark, or up really late, like dark. And that's not being very respectful of people. And so how are we going to work in an environment like that? Well, there's no easy, obvious answer, but somehow we've got to find ways for us to interact together in doing the work in order to get the most value delivered possible. So whatever means you can find, maybe you have to shift hours, maybe alternate. This sprint we'll get up early and you'll stay late, and then next sprint maybe we'll shift and spread that burden around. But that's what it is a burden. We shouldn't pretend that it's not, and we should, in my opinion, view that as an impediment and try to find ways to make it better. Could we find a way to have a whole team here, let's say in the United States, and another whole team here in India? Yes, but maybe we'd have to move skills around and find some other people and things like that. Well, if we don't start taking action on that, it's never going to improve. So again, focus on the interaction about people doing the work. That's what's most important. And always on video, visualizations, and any means that you can find to maximize that interactivity is how to get the most out of Scrum.
Great. Thanks, Mark. So with that, I want to thank everybody. If we can go to the next slide. And by the way, I did put the links to the evidence-based management and agile metrics videos in the chat, so you can see those there. Just continue your learning. So we have learning paths available for Scrum Masters, product owners, team members, as well as agile leaders. And those learning paths are a combination of videos like the one Mark referenced, blogs, articles, websites, and other things to help you keep learning as you go, broken up by a set of focus areas and learning competencies. Next slide. So with that, again, thank you, Mark, for taking the time today. Thank you, audience, for taking your time and all the great questions, and hopefully we'll get back to you with the rest. Keep following us on the forums, ask your questions there. Lots of experts always willing to help you, Twitter, LinkedIn, and so on. And with that, have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.